Those of us who'd worked on it in the earlier years knew that you couldn't have it all at once without tremendous dislocation and anguish, unless you gave a lot of money to local government to ease the introduction. And if you didn't have that as well, you were going to have a lot of trouble.
Two months after the fateful party conference, the poll tax bill was finally introduced to the Commons. This moment was to mark the beginning of a rebellion that would eventually topple a Prime Minister. Michael Heseltine, who had resigned his cabinet post over the Westland affair, had as a result been absent from early crucial talks about the poll tax. He now stood to bitterly oppose it.
Responsibility for the poll tax will now be targeted precisely and unavoidably at the government that introduced that tax. That tax will be known as a Tory tax.
The rebellion against the poll tax in the Conservative Party really began to grow in the latter part of the 1980s, and it began to grow above all because the incidence of it, the cost of it, became clear. You see, the very original estimates had suggested something of the order of £120 a head. Well, that very rapidly grew to over £200 a head. As the date for first introducing it came close, it was clearly likely to be something close to £400 a head.
A large number of Conservative MPs either voted against the bill or abstained. And it was only because we'd just been elected with a three-figure majority that the policy was sustainable, and a rebellion of, what, 50 or 60 people, however many it was, would normally have meant that the policy had to be abandoned.
Despite the rebellion and press speculation about its possible impact, Thatcher pressed on. The bill continued, passing through the Lords and gaining royal assent in the following summer of 1988. The public knew very little about the poll tax, but they did know that they didn't like it. A Gallup poll in late July showed that 54% opposed the new tax, with only 28% in favour.
Most people think a tax should bear some relationship to ability to pay. But with the poll tax, the very well-off person in a huge house paid exactly the same as the little old widow living next door. And it was just impossible to persuade people that that was fair.
By now, thousands of people were refusing to register for payment, resulting in even bigger bills for those who did. Implementation was turning into a logistical nightmare.
One authority reported its student population as jumping around like fleas in a bid to avoid the community charge payments. We had local authorities dealing with servicemen coming off ships, staying in their area for a few days and then going out again on exercise. And they're trying to track down these people just for a few days to get payments from them. It all proved very difficult and in the end impossible.
The person responsible for supplying the Prime Minister with media feedback was her press secretary, Bernard Ingham.
I said there are two insistent refrains. One, it's unfairness, king in his castle, poor man in his hovel. And secondly, that it will be difficult, if not impossible, to collect. And her attitude was quite simply this. It was one of the resolve and determination I'd come to know. The first one was to argue the case about fairness vigorously. And secondly, we shall see whether it's difficult to...
Ironically, those likely to be hit hardest by Thatcher's poll tax would be her very own voters.
What she was actually doing was to introduce a tax which precisely aimed the biggest losses at her key marginal voters, the people she had assiduously wooed, people who wanted to buy their own homes, people who wanted to work. They were the crack troops of the Thatcher Revolution, and they were going to be dumped on by this great big new tax.
I had people coming to my constituency surgeries every week, every fortnight, expressing very deep concern about the extra money that they were going to have to pay. And an awful lot of people in my constituency were actually living on very low incomes, and so the increase that they were going to have to pay to their local council as a result of the introduction of the poll tax and the abolition of rates was very considerable indeed. It represented a significant slug of their income.
The continual warning shots being fired from within and outside government were now deafening. But still, the Prime Minister refused to acknowledge them. The lady was not for turning.
The idea that Margaret Thatcher didn't listen to all this, didn't listen or didn't know what was going on, is ludicrous. But you also have to understand Margaret Thatcher, that she was a long-term politician, and she wasn't shifted by local difficulties or temporary difficulties as she saw it from a policy which she thought had long-term merit. So I don't think you'll find Margaret Thatcher apologising for the poll tax.
She'd had success with the miners' strike, with the Falklands War, privatisation, which actually was very unpopular at the time. She'd driven these things through, and so I guess she thought she could do the same with the community charge.
Margaret had taken on the critics, had adopted very unpopular policies and carried them through. And I think her attitude to the poll tax was rather similar to that. She felt that it was going to be tough medicine, but it was the right medicine. Therefore, the country had to take it.
But the public had no intention of taking Thatcher's medicine. The tax was first introduced in Scotland, and as demands dropped onto doormats north of the border, the secret was out. The government had underestimated the size of the bills. In 9 out of 11 local authorities, the new tax was higher than the estimates.
I think the only way to do away with the tax is for people not to pay it.
Some say, well, we're not paying it. But eventually, when it all comes to the end, I've got to pay it.
In April 1989, around 15,000 Scots joined a demonstration, the biggest in Edinburgh for years. That autumn, it was estimated that 600,000 people, 15% of the total population, had not paid up. Legal action in Scotland began. Things did not look good for the launch of the poll tax in England, now less than a year away.
I remember the Westminster people coming to see me, although I wasn't any longer directly responsible, and explaining to me what the effect would be in a street in Maida Vale. And it was very extraordinary, it was very uneven. And there were some very, very substantial increases and a few savings. Now, if that was the pattern in one particular street, that was going to be replicated all over the country.
I mean, she knew, as well as anybody else, that losers on the scale that we were now discovering were going to exist, that bills of the size that we were now discovering were politically catastrophic, and that they would threaten a huge number of our marginal seats. So she realised that changes had to be made.
Poll tax bills were now averaging £363 per adult. The original estimate had been £140.
By now, the bad news about likely future levels of the charge was coming through thick and fast. We were heading for double the original estimate. The political atmosphere was becoming grim. All my instincts told me that we could not continue as we were. I was deeply worried.